Уважаемые дамы и господа,
Ladies and gentlemen, participants of the conference, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you. And I'd like to say that I'm a representative of UNICEF of the Republic. It's a great honor for me to be a moderator alongside Kochkorov, Minister of Social Protection of the Kyrgyz Republic. I should like to say that today we have various experiences among the people who are going to be speaking with regard to the experience of Europe and Central Asia in social protection for children. We have Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan represented. I would like to ask all among the issues to talk about the most effective approaches for overcoming poverty. Secondly, how it's possible to finance this. Three, what possibilities you have and what challenges you face. And fourthly, what results you have had, and possibly, and after that, what recommendations you would make. Now, of course, these are all different questions, and there are a number of others that we would like to cover too. But I would like to start by asking each of you to make your presentations short so that we will have adequate time to deal with other questions too. And now I would like to hand over the floor to the Minister of Labour and Social Development. Thank you very much, Yukie. Firstly, I should like to thank the organizers of this conference for the possibility that they've given us to discuss the issues with regard to social protection in our countries. In the Kyrgyz Republic, within all political areas, including social protection, there are reforms going on towards sustainable development of the country. One of the priorities of the country towards 2040, in accordance with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, making a model for Kyrgyzstan, improving the quality of life and the dignity of human beings. First of all, to create the possibility for people to live well, a dignified life, and to develop. And one of the possibilities is grants. This is a priority for the Kyrgyz Republic. We were able to keep the benefits that people had from the Soviet period, and also to make the benefits more appropriate to a market economy and target them to poorer families. There are 6% of the whole population in receipt of these kinds of benefits, and about 1.5% of the population receive social benefits, which are paid out to those who have not made contributions to pension funds. Invalids, the elderly, and persons with disabilities. And this does not depend on their income levels. There are also payments made out. Sometimes we have, for instance, a single payment on the birth of a child, and this is given to all children born in the Republic, independent of the income of their parents. 40,000 som, that's around $57 is the amount. We also have help for registering children, for young families. This is absolutely vital for us to have the child registered within the system so that we can follow up on them. There are other benefits which depend on the income of the family, but they are undergoing a whole range of reforms. And the aim is to help those who are living in extreme poverty to come out of that. We look at the needs of the families, the income. We have targeted approach to this, looking not only at children, but we would like to have a universal approach to all children up to the age of 16. However, budget limitations means that this is not actually possible currently, and therefore we have to look at the minimum income, which is around $13 a month. That is the national minimal income. And those who don't receive this get an income through benefits to make sure that their overall income does achieve that minimum. This is for all persons in poverty. Looking at general poverty, 25%, 33% of all children are living in poverty. This is almost 300,000 children. And 12% of all children within our republic are living in poverty, considered extreme poverty. They are receiving less, in families receiving less than 20% of the minimum wage per month. There was an attempt to go towards a universal child grant, and the idea there was that all children up to the age of 3 would receive this universal child grant, independent of family income, and this would be up from the 3rd child and onwards, or for children with disabilities. Why was this? In order to create the necessary situation for child development. However, research was done, and the statistics showed that many of the poorest families in the Republic had only 1 or 2 children, not 3, and therefore they were not receiving that benefit. And so that is being reformed, and we are targeting children who are living in the greatest poverty rather than multi-child families only. Looking at the demographic characteristics, we feel that one of the problems is informality, and this makes it difficult for us to know about the incomes of the families. But on the basis of integrated household surveys, it seems that over 3 children in 10 are living in poverty. 63% of children over the age of 5 are living in poverty. So it's absolutely vital to say that the approach that we're taking is in accordance with the development needs of our country in our national plan up to 2040. And all of this is done for the protection of children and women. The prospects for the financial burden of this means that it's actually unable for us to implement all the reforms that we wanted to, and therefore we currently have this targeted approach. There is as I said, a high level of informality in labor in the country. And that means that it's not possible to have all of the working population contributing and involved in the social protection system. And of course, the informality is higher among the poorer levels of society. The World Bank figures show that 60% of poor families were actually excluded from the previous benefit system. And of course, another problem was corruption. In the situation of informality of labor, it was difficult to justify the provision of state support to those persons. However, we do want to ensure the development of children and the human rights of all children, whatever the work situation of their parents, and to ensure their development, including their cognitive development. It is now a year of development in our region, and we therefore are trying to move over to an electronic system for provision of government grants and benefits. We hope that this will make it easier for us to avoid corruption in the payment of grants and also to make access easier for caregivers of children, enabling us to reduce the level of general poverty overall in the country. Thank you.
Уважаемые коллеги, следующее слово.
Dear colleagues, thank you. I'd like to give the floor now to the Deputy Minister of Labour and Social Protection of Ukraine, Larysa Popova. Thank you very much. Firstly, I'd like to welcome all the participants and thank the organizers for the possibility of being with you today and to share the experience of Ukraine in our social protection system for families with children. Firstly, I'd like to talk about Ukraine. It's the largest country located entirely within Europe, 42.2 million people, 7.6 million. The overall number of children, 7.6 million. The budget, state budget expenditure for 2018 was around 991 billion hryvnia. That is around $35.5 billion. Expenditure on national social protection programs for the most vulnerable levels of societies were 137 billion hryvnia, or $4.9 billion, and 13.8% of the total expenditures. These were towards the poorest families in the Republic. So 13.8% of our total state expenditure was on social protection. Social assistance is, of course, one of the most important areas of government, and we spend a significant amount on supporting families in need. Social assistance in the Ukraine is for the most vulnerable groups, specifically women during pregnancy and childbirth, also at the birth of a child or at the adoption of a child, for children with serious illnesses not yet diagnosed with a disability, and those with disabilities from childhood onwards. We have a universal social payment for all persons living in Ukraine, whether they are Ukrainian citizens or foreigners with permanent residence in Ukraine, also for refugees, migrants, and those who require support. This depends on the income of the family, and also the wealth of the family. There are around 12 million families. Here you see a graph of the children, and we have children that need support from birth onwards because of the needs for education of child, support of the children, because, for instance, if one of the parents has to give up work in order to look after the child. We also have the assistance at birth or at the adoption of a child. Since 2014, we've had this childbirth grant, and in January 1st, 1993, we had the law on state assistance to families with children, according to which state assistance at birth was paid to working parents at the place of their work. This came from funds of Social Insurance Fund, and the unemployed received it from social security bodies from the state budget funds. So this support is in the dollar equivalent is in around $140 million. Now, the support that is provided for both working and non-working parents comes out of the state fund, and the childbirth grant is given to all children. It's not limited by whether or not people are working, by their income levels, whether or not people are Ukrainians or foreigners who currently live in the Ukraine. Everybody has the right to the childbirth grant. And for parents receive support up to the age of 3 if there was any insurance coverage for that period. Over the first 3 years of a child's life, the payment is given to one of the parents, and it can be done as a one-off payment immediately after birth, 10,320 hryvnia, which is $369. And within the next 3 years, the rest of the sum is paid in equal parts. And in 2017, the government spent about 22 billion hryvnia on the childbirth grant. This is 0.7% of the GDP. The other benefits are targeted and given to families with young children. Support on the birth of a child is given through the following mechanism. First, you have to register the birth of the child, and it can be filled out at a government center or online electronically, and this is becoming more and more widespread. And this ensures that we have support for families in precarious financial situation with the aim of reducing poverty in the Republic. It supports children up to the age of 3, but it does help in overcoming poverty. For instance, 2017, 61.4% of the benefits went to households whose income was below the current subsistence minimum. The aim of the childbirth grant has been to reduce poverty, and we have helped with this by providing the baby box. You can see that it provides all the necessary things for a newborn baby, and also very important information for new parents with regard to care for a child. The Ukrainian government is convinced that a baby should receive everything necessary from birth, independent of the region it's born in, independent of the income level of parents. This is also considered targeted support, although it is provided to every baby born in Ukraine. We also have a new program from January the 1st this year called the Municipal Nanny. Each family will receive part compensation for the cost of a nanny. The nanny must be employed officially, and this can continue up to the age of 3. The monthly compensation is provided up to the amount of the subsistence minimum per child. So a new type of assistance was introduced for those caring for sick children. Prior to diagnosis of a disability, this assistance is provided for each seriously ill child, for one parent caring for a sick child during the whole period of care, up to the amount of the subsistence minimum. The government also is looking at supporting children who are in care, under the care of guardians, or being adopted in children homes, for children who are orphans. And so for every child in that situation, they also receive up to the minimum subsistence minimum. There is also a program for financially vulnerable families, and in the situation that their income is less than the guaranteed subsistence minimum. Plans are now to simplify the conditions for obtaining these services related to the birth of a child, so that there can be just one registration which should register and be valid for all government services. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, уважаемая коллега, за такую...
Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues, for such a full report on your situation. And the next, we move on to hear about the Belarus situation. And we've got the Deputy Minister of the Labour and Social Protection of the Republic of Belarus, Valery Kavalkou.
Спасибо за предоставленное слово и возможность.
Thank you for giving me the floor and to tell you about the experience in Belarus for helping families with children. Looking at families with children, we've discussed how to support the family, both in material terms and also in terms of helping poor families. So I'd like to talk about the state support system which is provided today for families with children in the Republic of Belarus, because this affects not only material benefits paid to the families, but other social guarantees. For example, benefits related to childbirth and rearing, education and health, social benefits and so on. The main subject, of course, are the benefits. In Belarus, benefits for families with children are in 11 forms. They are provided independently of the income of the family. The only separate category is when the child is disabled, for example. It all starts before birth. If the woman follows all the recommendations of the doctor, she's given help from the 12th week of pregnancy. At 7 months, she's given pregnancy leave. And then maternity leave, depending on the difficulty of the birth. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the grants or benefits are differentiated. If the child is ill and one of the parents has to stay at home, look after the child, then they are paid a grant of 100% of what they would have been earning had they been at work. There's a one-off grant too. About $1,000. And then for the next children, %40 of the average wage. If the woman is not working, they're given payments up until the child is 3. These are the main benefits. On the slide, you can see the trends. The amount was related to the minimum subsistence budget, the national poverty line. Yeah, but in 2019, we decided to index this to the standard, to the average income of the country. Today, when the first child is born, the woman, whether or not she's been working or not, receives a one-off grant, the same value. And if it's the second or the following child, 40%. And for a child with a disability, then it's 45% of the average national wage. If a child with a disability is in a family, so as you can see from the site, from the 1st of January 2019, the allowance was paid to 310,600 children, almost 100% of the children under 3. In other words, the amount used for this allowance was 1.3 billion rubles, or 1.1% of the GDP. Just yesterday we were saying that 1.1% of the GDP was the average which is spent on the upbringing of a child in other countries too. Coverage is about 30% of children. So there is significant material support. But we've not always been able to achieve results. And people always require something new. So in 2015, we introduced a program of family capital for 3 and following children. $1,000 is paid. This capital can be received after the child is after 18 years, or in the case of medical need. Looking at other guarantees, labour guarantees, for example, pregnant women have to be assured that they can go back to work. It's prohibited to make pregnant women or women with children work on overtime or at night. And furthermore, when the child reaches 2, we realize the legislation says that women who have children under 5 are obliged to have their contracts at work prolonged. There are also tax breaks and pension benefits. These are guarantees that have been carried over from the Soviet times. For example, people rearing disabled children. She can retire 5 years earlier than the normal pension age. One of the reasons why people are need these grants is because they don't have proper living conditions. So here we have measures that provide financial support for living accommodation. So people requiring to improve their living conditions, if they have 3 children, the 75% cancellation of debts on credits provided to families with 3 children. And if they have 4 children, then it's 100%. For young families, there's 10%. In other words, we're trying to stimulate all this. families with children have additional burdens to bear. So when people have more than 2 children, they have free nurses. If they have 3 under 3, they get a nanny for 40 hours per week. And then they get help with food and with cleaning as well. Other social services are provided. For example, for these free of charge, they get temporary shelter, counselling, respite, because having an invalid child at home is very difficult. So there are kind of boarding schools where children can be placed for respite care. This costs $50. In fact, it covers just the food. This slide is characteristic of all European countries. It's the number of reproductive age women, and as you can see, it is falling off. This is caused by economic problems. It was caused by the collapse of the Soviet Union, the environmental disaster at the end of the 1980s. And so women who would have had children in that period didn't. So this is why Belarus has started to rethink the support of families with children. We've redesigned our family policy. So the help is given basically for children under 3. But between the ages of 6 and 9, they may well fall into poverty because another child is born under 3 years. So we're working on measures based on these population forecasts so as to support families that have older children as well. And I'm sure our discussions today will help us to develop these measures. Thank you.
Спасибо вам за...
Thank you for that very detailed presentation. I see you've made quite good progress in all this. And I now give the floor to Yulia Oleinik, the UNICEF representative in Uzbekistan.
It's a real pleasure to be here and to present the case of Uzbekistan to all of you. Just to say that the presentation that I'll be making is based on the work that we've done jointly with Stephen Kidd, and I believe it's been shared with all the participants. So I'll be really presenting just the work in brief, and if you have any questions on the graphs later, do ask questions. All right, so Uzbekistan. I'm sure you're all aware that it's a real jewel of ancient Silk Road that once upon a time was a hub for global trade, culture, and science. You may not know, but even the word algorithm or the algorithm came from Uzbek scientists long time ago, and now it has become the backbone of the digital economy. Today, Uzbekistan is a middle-income country with a population of 33 million, and it is at an important juncture. Since the political transition in 2016, the country has embarked on ambitious socio-economic reforms. Much is changing in Uzbekistan, including in the area of social protection. So in my presentation today, I will share with you key observations on the existing system of child benefits in Uzbekistan. I will also explore with you two proposals that we put together, universal and near universal, which could significantly improve the effectiveness of child benefit system in the country. I will also discuss how pursuing those options is not only the right thing to do from the child rights perspective, but also a good investment in the future prosperity of the country, especially in the current demographic juncture where Uzbekistan is. So the analysis that I'll present today is based on a household survey that we've done together with the World Bank and Development Strategy Center in Uzbekistan. We've done it in the summer last year. It's nationally representative and it covers 4,000 households. In the presentation, I'll be discussing a number of numbers and facts, and I think it's important to remember that behind every one of them are lives of real people and families. And what I suggest is that we begin with a story of one of them, a family in Uzbekistan that represents the lives of many. So let me do that.
Xo'jayinlar ajrashganman. 4 ta farzandim bilan hozir opchamning qo'lida kvartirada turaman. 4-etajda domda turamiz. Hozir bolalarning mas'uliyati moddiyadan, ma'naviyadan qarasa, men bo'ynimda bo'lgani uchun kunlik ishlarga chiqaman, gulchilik bilan shug'ullanib. Bolalarimga shu kunlik ishlab kelishimga kelgan pullarimga yetim qaramay, boshqa qilib 4 ta farzandga baribir qiyin bitta onaga. Shunga mahallaga chiqib, moddiy so'raganman, yordam so'radim.
O'zi ishlab topgan puli bolalarning usti-bosh kiyimiga, oyog'iga, boshiga narsalar olib beradi, kiyim bosh olib beradi. Mahalladan beriladigan nafaqa puli oziq-ovqat mahsulotlari olib oilasini boqadi.
Hali ular beradigan pulga bir qop un bilan 5 litrli moy olaman, shunga yetadi degan pul beradi. Boshida men shu xo'jayinlar ajrashganimdan keyin xuddi hech kim yordam bermaganda keraksiz odamdek bo'lib qolgandim. O'zimni shunday tasavvur qilardim. Bitta o'zim har yoqqa o'zimni urardim. Hozir bular yordam berib turibdi. Hujjat ishiga ham boshqaga ham maslahat so'rayman ulardan, yordam so'rayman. Qo'llaridan kelgancha maslahatni ayamaydi, yordamlarini ayamaydi.
3 ta kam ta'minlangan oilamiz bor. 3 ta odam moddiy yordam olyapti. Yana 4 ta oila navbatda turibdi. Chunki bizga beriladigan ma'lum miqdordagi mablag' o'sha 3 ta oilaga yetadi, xolos.
Xo'jayin tugul o'zimda umidim uzilgan edi. O'zim menda 4 ta bolam qanday ahvolda qoladi, men o'lib ketsam yoki boshqa qilsam tuzalmasam degan tushkunlikka tushib qolganman. Ya gapirish, ya kulish hech narsa yo'q edi menda.
Har bitta farzand uchun nafaqa puli berilsa, ayni muddao bo'lardi.
O'sha bolalarimiz ham o'zini tiklab, biron joyga ishlar joyli bo'lganicha yordam berib tursa, masalan bizga o'xshagan yolg'iz onalarga ancha yordami tegardi.
Shu 18 yoshgacha berilsa yaxshi bo'lardi, chunki o'sha kam ta'minlangan oilaning farzandi 18 yoshda o'sha maktabni 11 yillik maktabni bitiradi.
Hozir katta o'g'lim vaqt kelsa bir paytda maktabga bora olmaydi. Nimagaki agar u tinmay maktabda bo'lib, o'qishib, anaqa qiladigan bo'lsa, men ikkala tarafdan eplolmayman bitta o'zim. Vaqt kelsa bolalarimni ko'chada qolganlar, kunlarim yotib qolganlarim bo'lganda, shunga kim yordam so'rasa, qo'limdan kelgancha yordam berishga o'zimdan qilaman. Nima desa, jalb qilaman.
So we see from the video that the allowances are really making impact and make a difference in lives of children and families. And it's exactly for children like those of Charos that we work with the with our partners in Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Labor who are here today to strengthen the social protection system for children in Uzbekistan. So in the next slide here, you see that Uzbekistan has a very youthful population. 33% are under the age of 18, 60% are under the age of 30. In fact, the country is considered to be on early demographic dividend stage. What it means is that these young people and children of today in the next 10-15 years will be growing up and joining the labor force. And because of decreasing birth rates, the dependency ratio will also reduce. And that will create a real potential for additional economic growth in Uzbekistan if Uzbekistan manages to adequately invest in children, but also create decent jobs and enough jobs to absorb this growing labor force. And of course, investing in children, strengthening child development outcomes requires investment across a spectrum of social services, health, education, which Uzbekistan is deeply committed to. At the same time, the challenges that the challenge of low income that often parents have to grapple with create a risk that children's potential will not be fully realized. Or create an obstacle to its realization. And the survey has shown that a vast majority of children do live in low-income households with per capita incomes below $2 a day. Moreover, as we can see in this graph, poverty among children is actually higher than poverty among adults. And as we've heard over the last 2 days, this is not unique to Uzbekistan. This is what we observe in many countries. And if issue of low incomes is not addressed by social security system, the future of many children is at risk. And not only their future individually, but also it may have a knock-on effect on the national development. So this really brings the urgency of addressing the question of strengthening social protection for children. Now let me briefly tell you about the social security system in Uzbekistan. We'll just So Uzbekistan invests 9.7% of GDP in its social security system. So this is really a good indicator that compares favorably with other middle-income countries. And Uzbekistan also has an inclusive social protection system that's built around the life cycle and offers financial assistance to citizens from birth to old age. On this slide, you can see social protection schemes mapped against the life cycle, and you can see it's really at each stage in life. The government provides protection and social security schemes to its citizens. Now let's turn directly to child benefit system, and it consists of three benefits. One is for children, two of them are poverty targeted. One is for children under 2. Second one is for children from 2 to 14 years of age. And the third one is child disability benefit that is offered on a universal basis to all children with disability. And this is really a best practice internationally. And if you're interested in hearing more about it, tomorrow my colleague Omid will be presenting it during the disability session. So jointly, these three allowances, they represent a rather small part of the social protection system overall. And as you can see on this slide, the majority of Uzbekistan's investment in social security is actually in old age pensions and disability benefits. And despite a relatively young population, the tax-financed child benefits actually account for under 0.5% of the GDP. So you can see that 88% of those above retirement age receive a social protection benefit, whereas only 19% of children receive a benefit, while most of them do live on low income. But that's not always been the case. Uzbekistan actually inherited a universal child benefit system from the Soviet times, like I think many on the panel here. In 1997, the child benefit became poverty targeted. Since then, the number of recipients, as you can see on the slide, has fallen significantly. Last year, we've seen the reversal of this trend, and there's been a modest increase in financing. Similarly, this year, there is a further increase, but still, looking at the previous levels, it remains rather low. And here you can see that generally, the social security system in Uzbekistan does make a difference for standards of living and reducing poverty. You can see that national poverty rate overall reduced by 39%. But then the reduction, you can see that mostly, again, it comes, not surprisingly, from pensions and for people for older people. At the same time, you do see a rather significant poverty reduction effect for children as well. And as you will see on the next slide, that impact actually mainly comes from pensions. So pensions mainly reduce child poverty in Uzbekistan. They account for 70% of the reduction effect. And the child benefits account for 12% in reduction. If we look closely at the combined picture of child benefits, here you can see we can evaluate the targeting effectiveness. You can see that the inclusion error, meaning those who shouldn't be receiving it but receiving it, only 6%, whereas the exclusion error is 76%. We see that the current eligibility criteria amounts to about half of the households, but not many, or many of those who are eligible are currently not receiving the benefit. The government is aware of this situation and is actively exploring options on how to improve it. So now let me turn to the proposal that we've developed and now discussing with the government. Again, this is a proposal. This is one of the options that we could consider. Yeah, there is no doubt that vast majority of children would benefit from child benefit and immediate access to child benefit, given the low incomes that we just discussed. At the same time, we realize that the proposal that we have needs to be realistic and account for political realities, but also financial and fiscal constraints. Therefore, the options that we explore in the paper and in the slide that you see here, seeks to achieve universal coverage, but over time, progressively expanding eligibility. So the idea is to start with 3-year-olds, or with those that are under, with 0 to 3, so really those with the younger children, and gradually increase year on year by 1 year, reaching by 2034, reaching all children 0 to 18. And at the same time, all those children that join the program, they are not removed from it until they reach their 18th birthday. So the value that we propose, and you see here, it's around the value of the current family allowance that we have. And the difference, one option that we explore is universal. The other one is covering 75% of children, affluence tested. So taking out those that are well off the top quintile and focusing on others that live on comparably low income. Also, the schemes would initially prioritize, as I mentioned, the youngest children, given the importance of ensuring that every child receives maximum support in the first 1,000 days. So briefly looking at the impact that it would achieve based on the simulations that we've done, we see that these are the three, so we compare the two options with the status quo, with the existing programs, and you can see that if you look at what happens when we introduce it in 2020, the impact will be about the same as you have with the existing program. But as coverage increases over time, we see significant difference and improvement in effectiveness, specifically on reducing poverty rate and poverty gap of the two, yes, the two options. Now, how much would it cost? And I think this is the questions that we come to over and over again in this conference. So both options would commence in 2020, and they would cost initially 0.8% of GDP. And as I will explain in a minute, it's actually a feasible level of expenditure for Uzbekistan. Indeed, neither of the options would result in a fiscal bomb, as investment required, as you will see, will peak for the universal option at 1.5% GDP. And for the affluence-tested option of reaching only 75% will peak at 1.3%. The reason why it peaks and then falls is because we take into account the demographic trends, as well as the GDP growth rate. And so how do we assess that this is indeed a feasible and affordable option? Currently, Uzbekistan's planned investment into the three poverty or low-income family allowances for 2019 is at 0.64% of GDP. And if you combine with it all the other child benefits, including winter clothing and school supplies for children, it actually adds up to additional 0.2%. So together, it already gives us enough to start the program. Now, looking ahead, the projected GDP growth in Uzbekistan is 5.5%, and which is, of course, then is expected to generate significant tax revenues as well. And if we use a small portion of these additional tax revenues for the program, that will be enough to cover the program. And in fact, one of the feedback that we're getting a bit from the government is, and from some of the partners, is it ambitious enough? It is rather conservative. It's something, it's an option that makes it feasible to introduce it now. But obviously, if there is a political will to make bigger investment, that will see greater impact both on child poverty and I think economic development in the longer term in Uzbekistan. So just to conclude, there's never been a better time in Uzbekistan to introduce universal child benefit or near universal child benefit to strengthen the system for social protection in Uzbekistan. We see favorable favorable demographic conditions that can create an opportunity for Uzbekistan to take the country to another level if the country invests in children. At the same time, we do see that many children live on low incomes, and if we can improve social protection for children now, it will have an important impact on those children and families individually, but also on the development of the country in the longer term. And the benefit design and gradual introduction that we present here makes it fiscally feasible. And in the longer term, these investments will pay for itself many times over in the form of effective poverty reduction, greater well-being for children, and more productive labor force. Politically, like in many countries, a universal approach to social security is likely to generate popular support. And political rewards for the government in time of major socioeconomic reforms, I think cannot be overstated here. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Спасибо, госпожа Oleinik, за такую
Thank you, Mrs. Oleinik, for that presentation.
представитель Организации по экономическому сотрудничеству и развитию.
I'd now like to give the floor to Alexander Pick for a presentation on assessing the feasibility of a universal child grant in Kyrgyzstan.
Many thanks, Minister, Deputy Ministers, and indeed everyone gathered here today. It's a huge privilege for me to be here. And I would just like to say a huge thank you to the people with whom I could not be here. This isn't the Oscars, don't worry. But I look and I see Zhipara from the Ministry of Labour and Social Development, Nazgul and Gulsana have also been instrumental in the work that I'm going to be describing very briefly today. So thank you very much for all your support. So I'm in the fortunate position of talking about Kyrgyzstan today. Fortunate for two reasons. First of all, because it means I have studied Kyrgyzstan and had the privilege of traveling there a number of occasions and enjoyed every second of every journey. Fortunate also because we've heard a lot about Kyrgyzstan already during the last couple of days, so I feel that the legwork in some ways is done. I will not therefore spend too much time talking about the broader context and what I will necessarily be describing today. Suffice it to say that over the course of producing our social protection system review of Kyrgyzstan, this is just a flyer, it's not the whole report. But during the course of that, since around 2015, we were active in Kyrgyzstan at a time when the reform proposals around universalization were mooted and discussed in Kyrgyzstan, discussed internationally, and therefore we were very fortunate to be able to make an albeit small contribution, I think, to the conversation. So just a very brief recap. As you have heard, in July 2017, a reform to state benefits was proposed, moving away from the poverty-targeted monthly benefit for poor families with children, or just MBPF from now on, towards a three-tier benefit, a lump sum allowance at birth, a universal monthly grant for children under the age of 3, which from now on I will call the infant benefit, and then a universal grant for families with 3 or more children between the age of 3 and 16, starting at the 3rd child. So as the minister said, if you had 1 or 2 children, you were not eligible for the grant after the age of 3. So 6 months or so later, the reform was halted. There were popular protests about this, and there was also a certain amount of external pressure. I will hope this button works. So, in the intervening period, different options were proposed, which I will look at today. One of them, which is going to be the basis of this presentation, was around a hybrid benefit, combining universality for newborns and children up to 1.5 years old with a poverty-targeted benefit for children who are older than that. Another proposal was around excluding pension income from the means test, which is a whole different conversation around social protection systems and life cycle approaches. And it's fascinating, but we don't necessarily have time for it today. As I said, we've been able to look at these issues, not necessarily to the extent that we have all the answers, but I think this is just an interesting case study of some of the issues which are still live today. And as we've heard, Kyrgyzstan is still grappling with what is the best way to move forward with child grants. And it's really been fascinating to listen to the other speakers today, also from the region, who are also confronting these challenges and the imperative of investing in children. But even though significant spending is available on social protection, a lot of it goes to other age groups, particularly pensioners, and this is something I will come back to later. So why, very briefly, are child grants important in Kyrgyzstan specifically? Well, poverty is concentrated among children. Approximately 50% of the poor population are children, and that's not going into the broader measures of deprivation, stunting, for example, which are also problematic in terms of children's long-term development and their immediate welfare. There was also the broader context of Kyrgyzstan's dramatic decline in poverty from the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there was this huge spike in poverty, in inequality, and unemployment during the first 5 or 6 years, and then after the initial shock, these declined impressively, actually, and until around 2008, and then at about 30% of the population, poverty started to stall. So the decline was very minimal after that point. And it was clear that in order to kickstart that decline and to get the poverty rate considerably below 20% or further still, would require a change in the social protection system. So as we see, that chart just shows the poverty rate by age group, and it is considerably higher for children and notably lower for the elderly. So what is wrong with the MBPF at present? Well, what has been evident, first of all, there's very low coverage, around 5% of the population, or 13% of all children in 2015. Oh, sorry, 14%. And as happened elsewhere, the coverage has actually declined. At the same time, the benefit value has increased, but it's still very low. There's nothing nicer than an upward trend on benefit values in real terms, but when I tell you that the benefit is set at, has recently reached 50% of the guaranteed monthly income, which itself is set at around 50% of the extreme poverty line, you realize that these benefits are quite a long way from being adequate. As we might have heard at other points, as you might have heard rather, at other points over the last couple of days, the application process of for the MBPF is extremely burdensome and complicated, and the means test is very difficult to apply. And sometimes it's very easy to forget when you were sat in Geneva with its admirable transport links and everything seems to work very well. January in the mountains at 5,000 meters is a very different prospect. So it's nice to think about how easy it is to implement social protection programs in a vacuum. Much harder when you're up against some fearsome physical challenges. Anyway, so that's what's wrong with the MBPF, and why not universalize? Because as we see from this graph, with the universal approach that was initially proposed, those are the gray lines, versus the existing MBPF, the impact on poverty and extreme poverty is so much bigger. There's a huge, obviously, impact from investing in a universal grant related to an extent what I was saying before around getting rid of the administrative obstacles, and as the minister alluded to, there are issues around the governance, and all these sort of fall away, or at least many of them would, with universality. I say many of them because some of these relate to documentation issues, for example, and we forget that just because you have a universal grant, it doesn't mean that everyone will automatically have all the papers they need. But nonetheless, there are huge advantages to a universal approach. But very quickly, the government of Kyrgyzstan, but also some development partners, pointed out that this was going to be extremely expensive. Even bear in mind that we weren't talking about completely universalizing the child support grant up until the age of 16. We were the theory was that it would be categorical, but for children from large families. So even with that attempt to reduce the cost a little, the expense associated with universalizing was approximately double. So 0.6% of GDP on the MBPF versus 1.3% of GDP for this universal grant. It was also pointed out that it would put downward pressure on benefit values which are already pretty low and would leave current MBPF beneficiaries worse off. So the MBPF is characterized by major exclusion errors. I mean, upwards of around 80% of the extreme poor are excluded for various reasons from the MBPF, but those among the extreme poor who are receiving it and the poor population would have been left worse off by a universalizing reform under all circumstances. So that is something that's difficult to, a circle that's difficult to square, should we say, or vice versa. Before I move on, though, I would just like to say about the microsimulations that we're going to see. These are not, nor should they ever be treated as gospel. A lot of work goes into these, a lot of back and forth, a lot of going through the coding and making sure that every line is correct and the underlying data is good. So one thing that I did learn from this experience is modeling the impact of reforms is not something that is remotely straightforward. And anytime you see a reform modeled, take it from me, there is a lot of work has gone into it, and it is always worth asking to see people's working. But anyway, what we noticed when we analyzed then the hybrid reform option, because this is seemed to be the one which had perhaps greatest chance of gaining traction. So just to recap, universal benefit up to age 1.5 or 2 as we modeled, because modeling age 1.5 is actually very difficult, and then poverty targeted thereafter. And what we see is that the poverty targeted remains the most progressive. So what we see, and make sure I get my glasses on for this, but the light blue lines on the right-hand side of each decile, that's the MBPF, and where you see it declining very rapidly relative to the darker blue and the gray lines, that's just showing the greater progressivity. So yes, poverty targeting works to a certain extent. The benefits are absorbed by the lower deciles to a greater extent than the universal benefits, and also the beneficiaries themselves, and this is what this graph shows, are more located in the lower deciles. But what you also see is this correlation between poverty and number of children. So to an extent, even the universal benefits are progressive. They're just not as progressive as the targeted benefits. We see beneficiary incidence declining with income as the households become less, have fewer children, and their incomes are less stretched. So this was a sort of a valuable lesson. It's not as if universal benefits always go to the people you don't want them to, and there's the trade-off is not as simple as it might be portrayed as being. But then what does this mean for the sort of the overall impact? And this is, I think, what Yukie asked for at the start. What is the how to overcome poverty, how much does it cost, what are the challenges, and what are the results? I try and sort of capture them in this one table, which I think rather nicely shows how the sort of the orders of magnitude at play when you're talking about universalism versus poverty targeted. So if we look at the three components of this hybrid benefit, the newborn benefit, it's small, it goes to a relatively small number of beneficiaries each year, and it has, as you might imagine, a relatively small impact on poverty. But as a basis for a system, I think it's fine, and it has advantages in that immediately children are registered within the social protection system, and I think that counts for a lot. But then when it gets really interesting is the universal infant benefit for children up to their second birthday, and then the MBPF using its current targeting criteria for children aged 2 to 16. And would you believe it? Actually, more beneficiaries more children would receive the infant benefit than they would receive the MBPF, even though the age range is widely different, 2 years versus 14 years. And as a result of that, they cost more or less the same. They have a similar impact on poverty, although the MBPF is slightly greater because it's better targeted. And so overall, actually, this hybrid benefit turned out to cost more or less the same as the universal benefit that we looked at the first time round. And it really was the impact of universalizing up to the age of 2 in a context where Kyrgyzstan has quite a high population, high birth rate at the moment, one of the highest in the region. So that's certainly pushing up these numbers, but at the same time, that will tail off. So this isn't me making a qualitative judgment about which I would prefer. Our report actually pushes very strongly for an infant benefit that is universal up to the age of 2. But it just shows that this poverty targeting versus universalism debate can really, the numbers can be quite stark. So I took it upon myself because we proposed this infant benefit. We proposed this significant increase in spending on state benefits in the report. So I felt it sort of behoved us to find financing solutions, just as our colleagues from Uzbekistan did. I would say Kyrgyzstan's economic prospects perhaps aren't the same. Certainly 5.5% long-term economic growth is not necessarily something that can be relied on. And in any case, what's also telling is that in Kyrgyzstan, spending on social protection is probably higher as a percentage of GDP, so it's around 11%, and that's an awful lot, given the competing priorities, especially around infrastructure. And so I looked, the project looked within social protection spending as a whole to see whether or not using a sort of a systems approach to social protection, we could find available resources elsewhere. And reallocation across non-contributory benefits was obviously a non-starter. They equated to about, the main state benefits, that's the MBPF, and a the monthly social benefits, which goes primarily to people with disabilities, but also to the elderly and other groups. Combined spending on that is around 1.2% of GDP. So that's not going to get you where you need to go. But what we looked at was then this pension system as well, because it accounts for however much, probably around 7 or 8% of GDP just goes on pensions. And well, you know, pensions are contributory arrangements. State benefits are non-contributory arrangements, and never the twain shall meet. This is the world we were brought up in. But then you look actually at the pension system, and it's not non-contributory. It's not contributory to a large extent. It's propped up by very significant subsidies from general revenue, not from contributions. Contributions are being hit hard by the high rate of informality that we've heard of, huge emigration. Kyrgyzstan has one of the largest foreign workforces in the world, and it's really putting the strain on the sustainability of the pension system, which I would not deny for a second has a huge impact in reducing poverty. But you know, when we start thinking about what is contributory and what isn't, and what is where are sources of fiscal space, suddenly you think of these subsidies, and I find these graphs quite telling. So on the right-hand side, B, you have social non-contributory spending. That's not only state benefits and school feeding, but it also includes things like labor market policies and welfare services, residential institutions. So overall, that accounts for about 2.4% of GDP. If you add the transfers to the social fund, which is the pension system, that's an additional 3% of GDP, and that becomes a source of financing. Now, what does that mean for your pension provision? Obviously, politically, not very straightforward, but in a context of high informality, where fewer and fewer people are making the kind of contributions that they need to do to guarantee a decent income in retirement, the case for a contributory system, which is a relic, relic is too strong a word, scratch that. It's a legacy of the Soviet system, of full employment, of a cradle-to-grave coverage system where everyone is included, and which, since the shift to the market economy, doesn't really hold. There is such a strong case for a non-contributory pension, for a social pension, and there's resources available when you think about these subsidies that are going across anyway to fund existing pensions. And this is something that the World Bank recognized 4 or 5 years ago in an excellent public expenditure review of pensions. So we are in a... So that ultimately was my proposal. Reconsider pensions expenditure and see if, once they're in play, how you can allocate social protection spending across the system as a whole to maximize the overall impact on poverty and on welfare and indeed the future of the country. More information is available. Our report is in English and in Russian, and I thank you very much for your time and attention.
Спасибо, Александр, за вашу презентацию. Мы, безусловно, воспользуемся.
Thank you very much. We certainly will use the results of your analyses. Indeed, we're all gathered here together to try to find results so that we can overcome the problems. So we don't want people to fall through the system, and we have a law that was adopted very recently in order to try to find optimum results, to reduce the number of people who are excluded from the system, also to reduce those who are inaccurately included and receiving when they shouldn't be. So I wonder if there are any questions that people would like to ask for clarification. Our speakers would be able to respond to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. These are really very interesting experience from these 4 countries. I had a question to the honorable deputy ministers from Ukraine. For the child birth grant, for the first child, the benefit is higher, but for the second and the subsequent, it goes down. Whereas in the case of Belarus, is different. In the case of Belarus, the first child, the benefit is lower, but for the second, it goes up. You know, you see, it's different comparing to these two countries. So I was interested to get some more clarification on this. But Yulia, in the case of Uzbekistan, you have 3 child benefits. For the benefit for disability is universal, but for the 2, it is targeted. Can you clarify a bit why for these 2 it has not been able to make it universal as well? But lastly, to the Honorable Minister, who is also a chair, and Alexander, with the hybrid, whether you are likely to maintain all these 3, or you may drop one of these 3 as you go along. Thank you very much.
Начнем, наверное, с Украины.
Let's start with Ukraine. Thank you very much. Thank you for those questions. With regard to Ukraine, the benefits go to the first, second, and third children, and they all get the same amount. So the only issue is that initially you get an out payment, and over the next 3 years you get a monthly payment, and that's equal amounts of the remaining amount over the 2 years. Belarus? Yes, I've already spoken about this. So we actually have a reduction in the number of women of childbearing age in the Republic, and we therefore feel ourselves required to promote increased births. And so, for the second child, you receive more than for the first child. For the third child, you receive more than for the second child, and so on. And so we have a differentiated support for children, and with the increasing number of the children. Nevertheless, we see that families with larger amounts of children are still less well supported overall than those with smaller amounts.
Thank you for your question. Just to confirm that I got it right, you've asked why indeed the disability child benefit is universal. The other 2 are poverty targeted. And your question was, why are they? Okay. Once upon a time, as I mentioned, it was actually universal. Since 1997, it became targeted, I think in part due to fiscal constraints. But perhaps here I could hand over this question to my colleagues from the government who could answer that question.
Good day, yes, thank you. I should like to note one thing on this issue and on the question raised by the colleague. So apart from the disability benefit, all of them are universal. Child benefits to first, second, third child, and child benefits to children with disability. These are paid out whether somebody continues to work, whether they don't, they get the same amount. When we're talking about the Universal Child Grant, where there is an additional payment for families that have a low income. Now, the program that we have in front of us now is an ambitious program, and we hope that we will be able to find within the space of the budget enough to cover all children. Not only those with specific income levels. This will mean that it is genuinely universal. We want to have a universal support, not to just targeted schemes, because as Yulia pointed out, with targeted schemes, there are people who fall through the gaps. And the second task is to make sure that those those funds will be used in the correct way. Ukraine's example with the baby box is a very good one, because then we know that the funds are being used for things that the baby needs, because we are actually providing the items rather than just a cash transfer. So that question also, will families use child support to support children, is another one that's difficult to deal with otherwise. Thirdly, question I think that Yulia showed is the low sums. It's around $30, even less than $30. So people who don't need that amount will perhaps themselves not bother to go through the bureaucratic process to get hold of it. They may drop out of the system because that amount is not significant for them. The programs for children up to 3 years old, the current system that we have, so we're talking about if we're hoping that the system which currently covers children up to 5 will be prolonged and cover children as increasing age, I would also like to say that it's possible in the same country to have both targeted and universal approaches. So I think we're talking about completely different types of benefit here. So the universal approach is one that we use for the birth of the child. Everybody gets that birth grant. And another one that is universal, all disabled children, independent of the type of disability that they have, they receive 4,000 som, around $57 per month, in support up to the age of 18. And that is universal for children with any disability. But there are also targeted approaches. For instance, we heard from our colleague that there may be up to 60% of exclusions of people who ought to be receiving targeted benefits, but for some reason or another they're not. And that, of course, is a big problem, and this is what we hope to overcome with the new laws.
Наверное, один вопрос, и мы...
One more question and then we will finish. So just one more.
My question is to the last presenter, to Mr. Peak, about case of Kyrgyzstan. Just a brief question then. You're suggesting that in order to provide fiscal space for the universal child grants, to shift subsidies, pension subsidies, to finance them. This suggestion is made because it's the most politically feasible one, or because, I mean, there is a wide range of options, right, available. But that particular one, it's coming as a main one for what particular reason? Thank you.
I would say it might actually be the least politically feasible thing you could possibly imagine.
That's what I mean.
However, it's more of it's a sort of, it's an exercise in political commitment to an extent. But I also think the demographics of the informality, the demographics of the region, I think a universal old age pension would be the way to look at it. So you don't talk about changing the subsidies or shifting subsidies from pensions to child benefits. You talk about introducing a tax-financed social pension, which serves as a floor for pensioners to make sure that universal coverage, which is achieved at the moment, is maintained, because at the current rate, A, that will be very difficult, and B, financially, that would be quite ruinous for the government if it is to maintain pension levels at the same value in 10, 20 years from now.
И последнее слово.
And the last word. I'm very grateful for such detailed presentations.
It's late for this session. I think that the conclusion will be we are hearing in the next session. I just want to say that these are the countries which share that good history and very similar system, which is now taking a few different paths, but quite a close aim, but also very similar challenges, especially on fiscal constraints. So I would like to just thank all the governmental delegations sharing the very honest and the very detailed analysis. And I will leave my words for the conclusion for the next session, for that time constraints. Thank you very much. Огромное спасибо.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone.